Hola, buena tarde. Soy César Damián, soy cofundador de Fronda y director artístico de esta organización que desde 2010 impulsa el Encuentro Simbiosis, un encuentro interdisciplinar que provoca la intersección de las artes con otras áreas del conocimiento. Hoy arrancamos con una serie de actividades que tenemos en un programa que ha sido mudado al formato online, como la mayoría hoy en día, derivado del COVID-19. Estamos llevando a cabo todo en el ciberespacio. Tendremos un programa múltiple, muy enriquecedor, con una diversidad de artistas y de creadores y expertos del conocimiento que ofrecerán actividades diversas, pláticas, performance y proyectos de colaboración conjunta. Me honra esta tarde presentar a un par de artistas y académicas que han estado en nuestras ediciones previas, y la tarde de hoy tendremos la plática de Cartiere con su proyecto de arte público As the Crow Flies, cuya es una expresión en inglés que quiere decir la unión de un punto a otro que corre en línea recta. Ya nos contará detalle Cameron. Y bueno, voy a hablar un poco sobre su biografía muy brevemente. Cartiere es profesora de arte público y práctica social en la Emily Carr University of Art and Design en Vancouver, en Canadá. También es artista e investigadora, así como escritora especialista en arte público y la renovación urbana y los problemas ambientales. Es cofundadora de Borders Free Bees. Este proyecto es aliado de Fronda para un proyecto que estamos haciendo aquí que se llama Néctar. Asimismo, Cameron ha generado proyectos de investigación que desde el arte colabora con gobiernos municipales, artistas, escritores, ecologistas y científicos para convertir vías verdes descuidadas en pastizales polinizadores. Así que de esta manera utiliza el arte público como una fuerza impulsora para un cambio ecológico que pueda ser sostenible. Cartiere es coeditora y jefe de la revista internacional que se denomina Public Art Dialogue. Muchas gracias, Cameron, por la presencia esta tarde. A la distancia te saludamos. Asimismo, presento a Kristine Diekman, quien también es artista y académica y que tuvimos la suerte de tenerla en 2019 en el programa de Simbiosis. Y ella fungirá esta tarde como moderadora de esta presentación. Kristine es artista también, tiene 30 años de experiencia en la labor artística, pero también como educadora y líder de la visión colaborativa. Estoy solamente dando alguna información básica de ella, y ella ha producido y dirigido proyectos experimentales como documentales socialmente comprometidos. Por su trabajo ha sido beneficiada con premios y becas internacionales. Es directora de Video in the Community, cuya misión es formar estudiantes, miembros de la universidad y la comunidad para que tomen medidas a través de la producción, el estudio y el uso de medios digitales socialmente responsables y culturalmente sensibles, mismos que abordan la diversidad de la región y de la nación. Bueno, pues es artista de Nuevos Medios, hizo un proyecto precioso que se llamó, o que está en proceso este proyecto, y hizo una parte en México el año pasado que se llama When We Touch. Es un placer. Welcome, Kristine. Welcome, Cameron. Los dejo con Elena Barba, que es cofundadora de Fronda, y ella tendrá otro tipo de interacción y participación en este evento. Muchas gracias.
Hello, I'm Elena Barba, co-founder of Fronda. Today, for the first time in the existence of Simbiosis, Encounter of Interdisciplinary Art, we host online our 8th edition. Simbiosis usually takes place in the state of Hidalgo in Mexico. And although this year we've lost some of that physicality, we are grateful for technology that enables us to bring together from the very heart of their home artists and other professionals of various fields of knowledge to convey right here, right now on Awakening, Despertar, theme for this 8th edition of the Encounter. Today, we go beyond physical boundaries and border to reach broader horizons. Thank you for being here. Awakening from what or to what? Awakening from dark days in isolation? For some, awakening from a nightmare or from a deep state of mind and introspection. For others, awakening to a new day, to new possibilities, to a fresh start, or perhaps to a nightmare. How is art and artists facing this awakening? Today, I'm very honored to have two remarkable human beings who have participated in past editions of Simbiosis. Welcome Dr. Cameron Cartiere, Professor of Public Art and Social Practice at Emily Carr University of Art and Design in Vancouver, BC, Canada. She's an artist, researcher, and writer, specializing in public art, urban renewal, and environmental issues. And in San Diego, California, welcome Kristine Diekman, Professor of Media Arts and Director of Video in the Community at the California State University in San Marcos, a program that collaborates with organizations and individuals to enact social change. She's an artist, producer, and director of experimental and documentary socially engaged media projects. Thank you both for being here, and today we'll be exchanging points of view on the project As the Crow Flies, led by Dr. Cameron Cartiere. Thank you, Dr. Cameron Cartiere. Thank you, Professor Kristine Diekman.
Okay, so the project that I want to share with you today took place in 2018, and it was a 10-kilometer long public art and intervention that happened during the International Ornithological Congress. So the big bird congress that travels around the world and lands every 3 years in a major city. And this was the first time in its history it was going to land in Vancouver. So this was an opportunity to engage an audience that was quite diverse, bird lovers, scientists, activists coming from around the world to Vancouver, coming from across Canada. We have quite a significant research community, especially on the Pacific West Coast. And so one of the things that I was really interested in doing was creating what was the longest public artwork in Canada. And so this was a concept to, As the Crow Flies, to do a 10-kilometer long series during the week of the Ornithological Congress. Initially, it was quite ambitious. As you can see from the slide, we had lots of different concepts. And when it came down to it, we settled on 3. So we did a project called On the Wing, a project called Fledglings, and a project called Nestiness. And these were all very intense community engaged projects. And it brings a lot of issues up about how one might do projects like this in a COVID-19, post-COVID-19 era. So I'm just going to go through and highlight some of the projects and how they unfolded, particularly with community engagement in mind. So the first project was called Fledglings, and in Vancouver, we have a flock of crows that fly across the city every night to one of the largest rookeries in North America. It's called the Still Creek Rookery. And depending on the time of year, that flock can be 6,000 crows or swell up to 20,000 crows. And so we felt 6,000 was already quite ambitious. And so we recreated the flock, creating 6,000 individual ceramic fledglings. And each one was, this is the entire flock here. It took many months to create. I'll come back to that. And you can see that each one was individually numbered. That number served as both the signature of the work and an identification for each individual bird, as if the bird had been banded. It also, of course, had a very practical element to it, as it helped us keep track of where we were in the production. So you see here fledgling number 1 and fledgling number 6,000. There were 4 different forms that we used, and it was done through a press mold process. And so you can see here, we were quite a mobile unit. We set up our bird production stations along that 10-kilometer line that I showed earlier in the map. And we were stationed at community centers and schools, and people could come and participate and help make the various fledglings. And you can also see here that we already had a number of health and safety concerns. Whenever you do this kind of work, there's so much planning that happens behind the scenes, thinking about how you're going to operate, thinking about how people move through the space, and other issues, particularly around public liability. So these are things that are already on the mind of an artist that is working in the public realm. And so we had our production stations here, and so we had our production spaces, and what would happen is that you would have a lump of clay, you would press it into the form, the press mold, and then you bring it together in 2 pieces over to the press station. And once it went through the press, you'd open it back out, it would form a nice figurine, and you'd pop it out, and you'd walk it to the end of the line. Usually that was me. I think that I individually stamped at least 5,892 of these fledglings. And then the birds were left with us. What was really fascinating is that nobody seemed to have any kind of stress or anxiety or disappointment about the fact that they were creating this bird, but they didn't get to immediately take it home with them. From the very beginning, we worked with people to help them to understand that they were making a project that was bigger than the individual object that they were creating. And in essence, our messaging was, you're making a gift for somebody you never met, and they in turn are making a gift for you. So while somebody might have created bird number 592, and often people would want to take a selfie with that bird, the odds were they were not going to find that bird later when they re-emerged as finished objects. So you see them here in their state when they arrived back at our university, Emily Carr University of Art and Design, to dry. And then once they were dry, we dipped them in a black underglaze. And then they moved into one of our massive kilns at the university. A kiln like this can hold about 800 fledglings. So you can see that this process had to happen a number of times to get to our quota of 6,000. The kiln would close, and then the transformation would happen. Again, in the sort of post-COVID-19, this would be the point where one would say, well, all of the virus has been burned off of the bird, so it returns to a safe state. And yet, the birds still need to migrate back into the public realm. And so what we did for this particular project is we would load up all the birds and return to the community centers. And during the week of the Ornithological Congress, a part of the flock would descend into the lobby of the various community centers that were along that 10-kilometer line. So perhaps you were going for your workout or your kids' hockey match, And you'd walk into the lobby and there would be 500 or 800 fledglings. And you could simply go and select one. While there were 4 forms, each one definitely had its own characteristics, and that had to do with the handmade quality. So even though each was being pressed in the same way and had the same weight, a 5-year-old child's fledgling was going to look very different than a 30-year-old participant's fledgling. And it was really important that people could come in this condition and be able to select their own bird. They were also purposely made out of ceramic and this size because there's a physicality in the weight of holding this bird. There's also a fragility. The mortality rate of fledglings in general across the bird species is 50%. Our mortality rate, we were incredibly fortunate. I think only 12 fledglings didn't make it through the whole process. So many, many birds were sent out in many, many hands. The second project we did and used a similar community engagement methodology was this sculpture called Nesting Nests. And this particular work was temporarily installed on the Arbutus Greenway, which is a corridor, a pedestrian and bike corridor that traverses the city from north to south. It used to be the train tracks for CN Rail, and the city recently has been able to purchase that strip back. And so it's become this corridor of activity. And this piece was the first public artwork ever installed on the Arbutus Greenway. And in part, what we were doing was helping to actually create the policy for public artwork in the future on the Greenway. You'll see at the base of the nest, right here under the main nest, is a series of small handmade nests. And these were the community engagement component. Each time we do a work like this, it's an opportunity to talk with the public about different types of environmental issues, be it fledglings and people's affection or aversity to crows, or the whole nature of invasive species that we have, particularly in Vancouver. And so here we were working with the Parks Department to harvest English ivy. A lot of people are not even aware that English ivy is an invasive species. And then we use that material to transform it and teach people how to make baskets, and those become the nests. When we're doing this type of work, it is an opportunity to really communicate directly with the public. And again, people made these works knowing that they were giving them back to us to be part of a larger sculpture. And so I'm not quite sure how in future I will be doing work like this where I can be engaging hand to hand with a child to make something that was a bit more complex than they would be able to make on their own. I think these are some of the challenges that we're going to need to be addressing. But what this practice does is that it allows community members who are living with this sculpture to have a direct personal attachment to the object that now lives in their public realm. The sculpture was in the Arbutus Greenway for 3 weeks, as I mentioned, and then later it moved to another town nearby called Port Moody. And this is actually where it has its permanent home. And in order to connect this object that was made in one place to its new place, we expanded the community engagement and the nest making activity. So the iteration of Nesting Nests in Port Moody has many more of these handcrafted nests at its base. So in essence, the community of Vancouver joined the community of Port Moody in bringing this work and moving this work to its new location. The final project that we did was a collaborative animation called On the Wing. And this was a celebration of technologies and very much handcraft. And so at Emily Carr, we happen to have this wonderful contraption, which is a mobile projection screen. It's a tricycle set up with a battery where you can project anywhere. And so I worked with an amazing team at Emily Carr. Martin Rose, you see there with a wonderful group of student animators, and he served as our artistic director. And basically, I presented the team with a storyline of the mother crow taking the fledglings on their first flight. And so that emergence and that flight across the city. And they took it from there to create this work that was shown 3 times during the week of the Congress. And so on Monday night, we started at the northernmost point on the line in Strathcona, and we did a screening, and then a midway point on Wednesday. And then on the final night on Friday, we were at the southernmost point where we also had installed a nesting nest sculpture. And so here you see our setup, and that we wanted to engage people in a number of different ways. So they weren't only just passively watching this animation. And so part of what we did was collaborated with an artist in Vancouver, David Gowan, and he makes his own instruments out of a range of found and carved objects, and he works with a host of other talented musicians who do the same. Their band is called the Legion of Flying Monkeys. And David is part of the Fieldhouse Artist Program in Vancouver, which is sponsored by the Parks Department. I am also a Fieldhouse artist. And so this was an opportunity to bring other artists within a larger program together as well. And so what David and the band did was they developed an original score in response to the animation. And so they had a preview, yet each time they performed, they were influenced by the different audiences, and they were influenced by the different locations. And you'll hear that a little bit later when you actually watch the animation and hear the soundtrack. It was quite a vivid display. We were incredibly portable, and because of the nature of the projections, we had very much a 360-degree opportunity. It didn't matter if you were at the front of the screen or the back of the screen. People could move around. Oftentimes, children were actually engaging with the birds, so it almost became a performative or a participatory animation as well. Here you see us in some of our various locations. At the midpoint, we were at Queen Elizabeth Park, which is by the Blundell Conservatory. So you have this incredible luminescent dome in the background. And you see there a child in the lower left who's engaging with a set of wings. So we did sort of have a teaser at the beginning where people were actively invited to participate with the animation, and that invitation then seeped over into the fuller production. People felt they had been given permission by this gesture of the wing selfie, and were able to take that through. You can see there's just a kind of simple delight involved as well. One of the key elements to this whole project is the way in which the materiality of what we're doing is a vehicle to connect and engage with our community, with our audience, and a way to make tangible some of the complex conversations that we're trying to have, particularly around conservation and ecology. One of the things I noticed as well, and I also see this as a interesting and compelling challenge moving forward, is that when we left the fledglings in the community center, there was a delight that happened when people arrived, and there was a bird, and then maybe they had a little heads up about the project, and so they knew that they could take one. Others had to be actively encouraged and invited to take a bird, because we've often been trained, when you see art, you can't touch it. So there was one sort of engagement in that way, but there's another engagement that was completely different, and the one that I cherish, which is when I would walk up to a person and I would turn the bird over and look at its number and say, oh, this is 792 out of 6,000, and then reach forward and place the bird in their hand. And this gesture moving forward, 99.9% of the time was met with this gesture coming back at me. That people weren't like, oh no, you know, by taking that moment, by saying what it was, by showing the unique specialness of this particular object, and that this object is for you, it then made much more space for conversation. What is this project about? What is your story about crows? Are you on the I love crow side or the I hate crow side, and why? And then that opened up another layer of conversation about our shared habitat, things like the fact that urban crows have their nests much higher in the trees than rural crows, so people might be passing underneath and not even be aware that there's fledglings up above them in a sort of precarious position as they're about to take flight, and maybe that's why the crow dive bombed you that day. And so this sort of opening an invitation to have a conversation, and that invitation comes through the exchange of something quite physical, has been a real linchpin in the way in which I've had success in dealing with more complex issues and that have a more sustainable impact. I see these crows all around town. I see them in people's gardens. I see them on people's fences. I've even had somebody say to me, oh, you do work about bees. Have you seen this work about crows? And I think it's fantastic that they don't even know that I was a part of it. Our fledglings have taken flight all around the world. You see people here who took them back to Paris, to Hong Kong, to Brazil. I have had images sent to me of fledglings on the subway in Finland. Birds that have taken place in people's hearts and taken place on their adventures. And so there is something about that idea too of the memento and the nostalgia that is embedded within the handmade quality of these objects. And in this final slide, you see the culmination of the 3 projects coming together. This was the only time that all 3 projects came together on this one event. And I don't think that it's possible to reproduce a moment like this in a video format or an online format. And I think that one of the things that we all need to recognize moving forward with our social practice and our community engagement in public art is to develop unique projects that take on the elements of the online world and the social engagements that we can do on those platforms, and that we figure out how within the physical space we're going to be reinventing or reimagining these kinds of engagements that are more physically tactile, and that one is not, we're not trying to replace one way of working with the other, but figuring out what we've learned from one to apply to the other and back again. And that brings me to the end.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Cameron, for sharing your work in such a succinct and really very moving way. There's so many things that come up for me that I want to have conversation with you about that you've covered, but it'd be great to talk a little bit more about them. And of course, ending your talk on this idea, like, you know, how do we address this pivotal moment, right? And not, you know, not fall into despair, you know, still, I think, grieve a little bit or grieve a lot, you know, for what might be lost, but also, you know, be able to create the new conditions for hope rather than, you know, maybe falling into some kind of dystopia. So, what some of the things that came up for me that I think maybe we could delve into a little bit more deeply, and feel free to you know, sketch those out into the future too, is this whole idea of the tangible material, the haptic, which comes up over and over again in all of the work that you just showed. And so, so there's something about that ability of of your participants, the communities that you're working in, to be able to touch and make and feel the, I don't know, like the squishiness of the clay or the force of the mold, or the weaving of the basket. So could you talk a little bit more about why you feel those kinds of processes and activities are important in this work to understand this larger concepts that you're dealing with around ecology or conservation?
One of the things that I have found is that physicality is something that grounds people in the process. And so, you know, I calculated that from when this was one of our demos, and it was actually really important to have a demo so that people could see what the end result was going to be. So they didn't have to imagine it. So again, that physical presence sat there. None of these disappeared either, which was quite interesting to me. But when you started with a lump of clay and you ended with my gesture of this to you, or the bird sitting on the shelf in a community center, we estimated that bird through the process had been handled 10 times. Right now, that's a COVID-19 nightmare. But there was something that I think had a deeper resonance. The fact that so many people had to touch this bird along the way in order for it to arrive at its destination. So many people, it illustrated in a way, these type of projects, how many people are actually involved. I did another project called Border Free Bees, where we converted neglected greenways into pollinator pastures, using public art as a driver. And at a certain point, we needed to figure out how to make the pasture travel. So we came up with a project where we made paper bumblebees out of handmade seed paper. And so that whole process of making the paper, actually even collecting the seeds, installing the butterflies in the gallery, one bee at a time. So installing the bees in the gallery. There was a physicality experience that when we talk about numbers, like a beekeeper loses a beehive, and in a beehive is 10,000 bees. And when people maybe visualize a beehive, they think of a box this big and this big. But when they walk into a gallery and they're surrounded by 10,000 paper bumblebees, it's overwhelming. Like the number of people who walked in and were just like, whoa. And this is what 10,000 looks like, right? And now imagine the thousands and thousands of beehives that suffer from colony collapse disorder every year. right? And then there's that physical presence. The other thing is the labor. I think the labor has tremendous value. There's often a mystique about how artists make things, and oh, I could never do that. I don't have the talent, or I don't know how to do this or that. And to be able to allow people to come in and be part of the process, and that part of the process is crucial. I mean, yes, if I had enough time, and these days it seems like we have all the time and no time, I could make 6,000 birds. But really, I want to be making 6,000 birds with 600 people. And the same with the paper making. Yes, physically it could become a labor of love. It's already a different type of labor of love. But the drawing in of people to be physically engaged with the work, from the actual making through to the experiencing of it, seeing when it's done, I think really helps people to understand the value of that creative effort more than the end artistic concept.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. You know, it brings me to a couple of other thoughts, one of which you talked about earlier in your talk, and then something you just said right now. And it, you know, has to do with this idea of the gift giving. We talked about this the other day, that, you know, within your work, it really expresses the culture of gift exchange, right? Rather than commodity exchange, or commodity culture or market exchange. And I think also when you're talking about, you know, the collective experience of making something, that everybody makes it together and we know we're making it together, it also adds to this idea that we're not working within a market exchange where you don't know who's doing the making and we're really disassociated from the production. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the importance of that gift exchange, and the idea that maybe now in their current environment, I'm thinking of things like the collective experiences of mask making, you know, the cloth masks. Like how do you think those things are connected? Because we do want to try to also move from, or take with us what we know and look at this moment. So I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit, about how you might see that happening now.
Sure. Yeah. So in that process of making, for the most part, again, we didn't have to say often, like, you won't get one of these right now. You can't take it with you right now. Same when we were making paper, that we would say to people when we were making the paper, because we had to take it back to the studio for it to dry and then get laser cut, we would say, come to the gallery and see if you can find your bee. So in all of these aspects, I think it's important that people can see elements of what the end result is, because I think oftentimes they don't know how to give the gift if they don't know what the gift is actually going to be, right? And every time we deinstalled the exhibition for Board Free Bees, we would give half of those bumblebees away. They were embedded with pasture in your pocket, right? And some people cherished them and kept them as a memento and didn't plant them at all. Over and over again, this idea that you're making a gift for somebody that you might never meet, and they're making a gift for you, would give people pause. And oftentimes they would stay and make 5 more birds, right? That in the way that, you know, we're all in lockdown, and I look out the window and I in my complex, and I think about my neighbors and how they want to give. They want to be a part. They want to, the problem seems so huge. And yet, what is the tangible thing that I can do? So if it's making a mask, or making several masks, or being able to do groceries for somebody, or some kind of gift, I think that the value of that is that we feel the value. We feel that we have value, right? I know and again, it feels in some ways like it happened last Tuesday, and in other ways it seems like, you know, a world away. But, you know, just last year, Australia was on fire, right? And everybody started knitting mittens for the koala bears, because it just seems so overwhelming, like the loss, the suffering, you know, but that you could physically do something. I mean, it was ironic that they actually had to stop making mittens. We have too many mittens. But, you know, that was the immediate response. I'm a world away. What can I do sitting here in my own home? And that may actually be the key for how we do social engagement in the future. I'm thinking about a really large-scale project that happened many years ago when somebody had the outrageous idea that they wanted to knit a bridge cozy. And so they basically like yarn bombed one of the bridges in Pittsburgh. And how they did it was crowdsourcing, right? And crowdsourcing's been around for a while. And so, you know, people could knit sections of it, and they could do different colors of the grid, and they could be a part of it. And they may never have gone to Pittsburgh, and they may only be part of the media audience, or even, you know, the audience of myth and memory. But they had an opportunity to be a part of something, right? They didn't need to have the idea, but they were able to engage in the agency.
Yeah, you know, that brings me to this other question that I have about, you know, the scale of these problems, whatever they happen to be. And when you're talking about, you know, the kinds of scale of environmental and ecological problems, and often as, you know, citizens, we see these things unfolding before us. We feel helpless in the face of, you know, climate change. We don't maybe even understand climate science. So could you talk a little bit about the importance of being a science communicator? Because I think that when I've talked to scientists, because I do work around water, scarcity and water contamination, and one of the things they've said to me, because they're water scientists and climate scientists, they feel this sense of failure, that they have all the data, but they can't communicate it. So I'd love to have you talk a little bit about what it means to be a science communicator. And also, I think maybe along with that, the idea that you're doing data visualization.
It's true. I often or always work with specialists, work with different scientists, biologists, ornithologists in this type of work. I think that's crucial. I am an artist, I'm a researcher, I'm a professor, I'm not a scientist. And that one of the things that I'm able to do is to be able to bridge and to make that some of those complex ideas relevant to an individual in the moment. How does this affect me now? Why do I need to know this? How is this relevant to my life today? And whether it's, you know, running a BID workshop, because I worked with scientists and they taught me how to do it, and now I'm teaching you how to do it. And I would have students say, I don't know, this is really scary and complex. And I would say, well, I'm an artist. You know, I'm Dr. Cartiere, but I'm not that kind of doctor. And I'm doing it and I'm teaching you. So if I can do it and I can teach you, you can do it and you can teach somebody else. And it's that next level that I'm working with people, not to just teach them the information, but to give them the information and the ability to share that information further down the line. And in that way, I think, and I kind of am already seeing it, is that can we be the virus? Can we as artists be the virus that is the vehicle that creates change? You know, I think about the notion of, you know, we're all trying to recycle in our own homes, and we're trying to take the bus more. And oftentimes we see these reports where it's like, oh, well, you know, that's so nice what the individual households are trying to do, but really it's the big issues and the big things that we need to have change. And I think to myself, well, actually, yes and no, right? Because if everybody on the planet, you know, like plants one tree, that would have a significant impact, right, on carbon capture. Well, how do we do that? Is, you know, there's certainly different projects that are happening that, you know, you can send $1 here or whatever to plant a tree. But what if it was an art project? What if it was something that really inspired the information and was able, through both the physicality, but also the digital realms and media and the other amazing ways in which we work, to inspire people to want to make that gesture, right? That on a global level, that could be amazing. And the fact that a physical virus can travel as fast as it has around the world, how fast can a really powerful idea travel around the world?
So when I think about that, you know, so, you know, the physical virus finds a host, you know, an agreeable host, allows the, you know, the host allows it to replicate. and so it's fun to host in us. And so, so when I think about your work and the number of people that it has touched, thousands, right? Because these people are taking thousands of birds, and also the, you know, the participatory aspect of your screening, there's just people there. And they're aware of each other in, you know, as this collective, as this group, right? So how do you, to take the virus, you know, metaphor further, how then do individual people become the host to spread the idea, to spread the action? Because I think about all the people involved in your work. And, you know, do they come back? Do you ever get them like to come back to say, hey, I was there and this is what I'm doing now? And those are the people who are going to pick it up and take it further, right? So how do you do that?
Are you asking me if I have groupies?
If people come back to you and say, it was amazing, I want another bird, I want to take it to somebody else.
Well, we actually have had, like, people would say, if, you know, can I take a bird for a friend? And I would say, well, yes, but you need to tell them why. You need to tell them why. And I would then say, why number 5,497 is important, right? And so they then are entrusted with the message of the work. Several of my projects, I've designed my own obsolescence. And so the plan is, like, I can get in there with resources that maybe other people don't have access to, you know, as an active researcher, and I write a pretty good grant. And to be able to take that work, and that it's not just the dissemination of knowledge, but it is actually allowing people to take this project, and use that blueprint or framework to adapt it and then make it their own. It'll be similar, but it'll be their own. We did that going down to Mexico and working with Fronda. The idea wasn't to simply redo a pollinator pasture the same way that we did it in Richmond, BC, in Pachuca, Mexico. The idea was to go down and say, this is what we did, this is how we did it, what are your concerns, needs, and issues, and how might that translate into something that would work for you as a community, And I mean, and these also take time, right? So it was 2 years later, going back and working with the group to come up with a concept that, well, there they could have a 24-hour pollinator sanctuary because they had bats who do nighttime pollination. Well, now that's your project. It's absolutely, I take the framework and go, and now that's your project,
So I had another question. Maybe you've talked about it a little bit, but there's this idea of these new modalities, right, that we have to start to explore, and you've talked a little bit about that. And what I'm almost hearing in this, COVID and post-COVID moment is that, we're going to have to be doing things together apart. And so what are your ideas about, like, what new modalities can you imagine for what you're doing? How do we do things together apart?
Well, I think that there are opportunities there, but what I hope is that these things start to sit in tandem, and they serve different functions and they complement each other in different ways. And so, last week I was involved. I say involved. I wasn't, and this is interesting. I felt involved. So I watched a project that some colleagues of mine, Sans Façon, organized. That was a durational project. So you were committed for 5 days to observe this live reading of a work that they've been doing for several years, Stories from Here. And it was, 15 minutes. And then you could sign off after the 15-minute reading, or you could hang out for a little bit and listen to some of the Q&A and things like that. And even if the project had been here in Vancouver, where I'm at, and say it was down in Stanley Park, I don't know that I would have been able to commit to that full durational experience, because it would have also included the time for me to get there, be there, the time to get back. Oh, maybe I wouldn't have been able to do the meetings that I really needed to do for the university. But because it was this narrow window where I literally just had to click on, and then I could click right out. And I was able to have that experience where it built over the week. It changed. I changed. I was able to experience it, try different ways of experiencing it, stay a little longer, sometimes have to leave sooner or the other. But I felt that even by my presence, I was never on the screen. I asked one question. So that was the only way that some people knew I was there. But I felt that I had participated and not just observed. And I still need to sort of think about why that is. It goes beyond the fact that I know two of the people who started the project. There were many other people involved, and I've never met them. But I felt that I was part of it.
Right. One of the things that came up in that you said, that I was thinking about that too, was the durational aspect of it. That you felt like you were committed and you were involved because of the durational aspect, even though you were free to come and go. It's almost as if you know that it's happening, and you can be living in parallel with that and dip in and out, when you want to, or just commit to the whole thing. So, and that kind of brings me back to the durational aspect of your work, that, there's this process that takes place over time, but also it continues to live on, by itself. So I really makes me think about that a lot, that, now we're in this moment where we have as you said, we have all the time and no time. Time has completely changed, and, we just think we have all this time, but somehow we don't. So, so there's something I think to ponder there about how we engage durationally, because I find myself now skipping from thing to thing to thing. Before I'd multitask, but this feels different to me. Like the demands are somehow different. And if we could just create experiences that have duration, where we feel that we can like sink into them a little bit, or feel connected to them, or involved, as you said, or commit to them, I think that that would make a really big difference too.
I think there's something really to be said for the live element. The fact that
Absolutely.
the nature of that particular work is it's only ever performed live.
Mm-hmm.
And so the producers, the artists, they resisted the temptation to represent it while they recorded it so that they had it for archives and for reference and kind of to use as like acting notes.
Right.
It won't ever be like rebroadcast.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew that if I didn't make that 15-minute window, then I was going to miss it. And there was sometimes you had to make decisions about that or not, but it, even though it didn't cost me anything, it cost me my opportunity to be present in a moment. And so that value held with me, and I made sure it was in my calendar. I would be in faculty meetings and it would be like 10:59. I said, I have another meeting, I have to go. And I go. And the thing that was interesting about it being live all around the world, it meant that, it was 11 a.m. my time. The moderator was in Scotland, so he's almost in tomorrow. And, those people who are watching it in New Zealand, they're definitely in tomorrow. We're in there yesterday. I find that really fascinating.
So there's also that synchronous quality to it as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing else that I have, at the top of my, my head right now, but is there anything else that you wanted to talk about or bring up or say in conclusion to our discussion today?
I think that there's so many things that we, as artists who work in the public realm, have to consider already in terms of how we engage with public. And, part of that has to do with our pedagogy, but part of that has to do with really practical considerations, health and safety. We live in a very litigious society. And going forward, doing a project like this, if somebody participates in one of our projects and takes away took away this bird and happened the next day to get COVID-19, will somebody be coming back to be like, you gave me COVID-19? The things that we're going to have to think about now in terms of risk, other like unseen risk, is something that I've heard this expression often about, you can't get the genie back in the bottle. We've all discovered this new way of working, but we've also discovered new other considerations and new other risks that we took for granted before.
Right. Well, thank you so much. It's really great to meet you and talk with you, learn about your work. And I hope that we can have further exchange. And I also want to thank Elena and Cesar for organizing our discussion as well.
And everybody, please stay and watch that animation. It was quite a lovely experiment. And this was one version of one night brought together. And there is sort of an intentional, long, dark moment. And as David says, wait for it, wait for it.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. That was wonderful, very interesting. And I just have a question for you both. You both have been here in Mexico during Simbiosis. And how did you experience this excess of physicality in this country? Were you annoyed by it? Were you flattered? Were you overwhelmed? And if you come back, how would that change in your mind because of this situation?
Well, when I was in Symbiosis, the work that I did there was about touch, right? So exploring what it is like for people to touch each other and to touch in Pachuca was a revelation for me, because I had come with some preconceived notions about the prohibitions around touch within my own culture, and so getting there was like it was liberating. It was unbelievably liberating to have that happen, because the participants in the workshop that I was doing, immediately dove into it. There was no interface, there was no hesitation, and I just saw so many beautiful expressions of caring, of recognizing the other person they were working with, of witnessing a story, and people physically holding each other to hear their stories or touching each other. So that, to me, it was such an incredible gift in my thought process around that particular project. And so, I so wish that, that would continue, that we could get back to that. And, the way in which the body is used and the way in which the body is presented and mobilized is so different right now. And, that I don't know how to go forward with that. One of the things that I'm thinking about for my own work, and this goes back to this idea, that I was asking Cameron about data visualization, is that I do a lot of, sonic or sonification, right? Data sonification. And sound can be equally impactful as touch, because it's vibrations, right? So you can have transmitters and receivers that actually can bring the physical materiality of voice, let's say, into the body without actually physically touching anymore. So that's what I'm thinking more and more about that. But yeah, I just remember hugging everybody in Mexico. And it was fantastic. And I don't know what's happening. I mean, I know a little bit what's happening in the news, and I live on the border with Tijuana, and it's a disaster what's happening there. So that's my reply.
Thank you, Kristine.
I've always been a very physical person, very gregarious, and I mean, even as a child, evidently, I would walk up to strangers and be like, "Hi," and so for me, going and being with you in Mexico, that felt incredibly natural, and in a way, it is part of my challenge in doing this work. I have a highly textured voice, which means it doesn't do well projecting. And so part of the work that I do has a sort of physical intimacy, pulling people in close, that physical exchange, that working closely. And I don't know what the new way forward is. And maybe that is part of the challenge, but how can we, find a different way that our proximity doesn't make us feel compromised, but also doesn't make us feel uncomfortable and isolated. Maybe that is just, the passage of time, and we get to another state where we can all come back together, and that touch isn't taboo. But it may be something for some of my colleagues at Emily Carr, who do innovative clothing design. And it's that the textiles will make the tactile happen again. Turn it over to the artist. We'll figure it out.
Do you see each other working on something together now that you know each other?
Yeah, I would think. I mean, part of my work has to do with, the environment. I work with, as I said, with water and water science. So I'm really interested in the the science communication aspect. I also just recently started taking up birding. So I was really interested in your crows. And as I was talking, crows were flying by, so I kept watching them out the corner of my eye. So, so ornithology is something that's a hobby.
And also, I think, you know, we're here in this particular moment with our artist hats on, but so many of us too have multiple roles in academia and our ways of being in the world. And so, you know, I also write and I edit and put together anthologies, and so often I meet the most amazing people, and it's like, okay, an opportunity arises. You know, those certain connections are made, and sometimes they're very surprising, and it doesn't always look like what you think it's going to look like.